Imagine a clay rectangle slightly larger than the palm of your hand. This object is kept under glass in the Hilprecht collection at the University of Jena in Germany. It is known in academic circles by the rather dull inventory number HS1097. Before you lies a piece of fired clay, created around 1500 BCE. Its surface is scratched with clear lines, rectangles, and cuneiform symbols. I stared at it for a long time before allowing myself to ask the obvious question. Nippur was located about 100 miles south of modern-day Baghdad. In ancient times, it was the most important religious center in all of Mesopotamia. The city covered an area of about 370 acres of densely built-up territory. According to archaeologists' estimates, tens of thousands of people lived here. It was a true Bronze Age metropolis with a developed infrastructure. The clay tablet HS1097 has survived for millennia in dry soil. It weighs no more than a couple of pounds but contains a colossal amount of data. Excavations in this region were conducted by a University of Pennsylvania expedition in the late 19th century. It was then that this piece of clay first saw the light of day. Since then, the artifact has been studied by dozens of prominent cuneiform specialists. The traditional approach requires viewing this object in a purely utilitarian light. It is assumed to be a working tool of an architect or official. Such a document would have helped calculate taxes or plan wall repairs. Every line here must have a practical, earthly justification. But the text on the tablet resists such a simple reading. At the edge of the map are symbols that translate as the names of the gates of heaven. They are not tied to physical gates in the city wall of Nippur. Moreover, numerical values are indicated next to them. These numbers are too large to denote acres or feet of earthly area. They point to a completely different scale of measurement. The Sumerians used a complex numeral system based on the number 60. Their texts frequently mention the unit of measurement, beru. This concept could denote both distance and a period of time. On map HS1097, the concept of beru is applied to objects outside the city walls. This forces us to take a fresh look at the true purpose of the drawing. We are accustomed to thinking that ancient people thought exclusively in local terms. Their world was supposedly limited to the visible horizon. But the Jena tablet offers a completely different paradigm of thought. It unites the physical layout of the city with the topography of something larger. And the main question is this: where exactly do the lines leading beyond the edge of this map go? The academic community offers a logical explanation for the oddities of the Nippur map. Scholars consider these extra lines to be copying errors or schematic representations of canals. This interpretation is well-founded. Ancient scribes did indeed often copy old texts and could have made inaccuracies in their drawings. Practice shows that many cuneiform documents contain errors. Furthermore, riverbeds in Mesopotamia frequently changed course. Over the centuries, the landscape around Nippur has changed beyond recognition. What appears today as an empty line could have been a dried-up irrigation canal. The region's agriculture depended entirely on a complex network of such waterways. Therefore, their inclusion on the city map seems entirely justified. Proponents of the official version also point to religious symbolism. The temples of Nippur were considered the abodes of the gods on earth. Therefore, scribes might have added mythological names to real objects to confer status upon them. From this perspective, the heavenly gates become merely a metaphor for ordinary granaries or shrines. This is the standard approach to interpreting any ancient Near Eastern texts. But this established paradigm does not explain the following. On tablet HS1097, there is a straight line extending beyond the outline of the Euphrates by exactly 7 inches on the original scale. It is accompanied by a cuneiform commentary indicating a distance of 3,600 beru. Translated into modern American measurements, This amounts to hundreds of thousands of miles. No canal on the planet could possibly be that long. To ignore these specific figures is to be selective in the scientific method. We accept the dimensions of earthly temples because they match excavations, but we dismiss as a religious metaphor anything that does not fit within earthly parameters. The Nippur map contains no visual distinctions between the actual park and these distant objects. The ancient draftsman rendered them with equal technical precision. The official version suggests that the Sumerians mixed an engineering plan with fantasy. However, the tablet was found in an archive where strict business documents were kept. There, they recorded the harvest, which amounted to thousands of pounds of grain. In such archives, there was no place for poetic metaphors or fairy tales. Every entry had legal or economic weight. Let's look at the thickness of the lines on the clay itself. The canals are carved with deep, wide grooves. The lines extending beyond the city limits are drawn thinly, almost like directional vectors. This is a deliberate visual distinction made by the hand of a master. He clearly wanted to show the different nature of these objects. Traditional history claims that such artifacts are simply local maps. If the numbers don't add up, it means the Sumerians simply didn't know how to measure long distances. But the buildings in Nippur were constructed with incredible geometric precision. The temple foundations are aligned with an error of less than an inch over tens of feet in length. People who built with such precision could not have accidentally written an astronomical number on a drawing. We face a paradox in interpreting ancient sources. When the Sumerians write that the neighboring city is 10 miles away, we believe them. When they write that a specific distance must be traversed to reach the upper world, we call it a myth. But on the map, these two realities exist within a single coordinate grid. They are linked by a common scale and a unified mathematical language. The Hilprecht Museum cataloged this site over a century ago. Since then, the paradigm has not changed. Students continue to be taught about the simple layout of the ancient settlement. Anomalous calculations remain, overshadowed by highly specialized linguistic debates. The time has come to examine this data without preconceived filters. At the very center of the Nippur map lies a rectangular complex. This is the Ekor Temple, the main sanctuary of the god Enlil. The physical ruins of this ziggurat now rise above the Iraqi desert. American archaeologists have removed hundreds of thousands of pounds of rubble and sand from the site, but on the clay tablet, this complex is designated by the term Dior and Kei. A direct translation of this Sumerian word sounds like connection of heaven and earth. Official science calls this a poetic title for a tall building. This position makes sense, since religious structures were often given lofty names. But in the texts found near the map, Duranki is described differently. It is not just a metaphor for height, but a specific reference point. A document from the University of Pennsylvania Archives, CBS 19767, contains a technical description of Duranki. It states that it is the axis around which the upper world of AN revolves. On the map, a thin, straight line extends from this temple beyond the edge of the tablet. It does not connect to any of the city's structures or warehouses. It points into the empty space of clay, where there is no earthly topography. This explanation is consistent. It is also universally applied, as a way to never ask whether a statement is true. If you label any incomprehensible phenomenon a cult symbol, you can close the matter forever. But the geometry of the line on tablet HS 1097 defies such logic. The line was drawn using a tool resembling a ruler. In ancient texts, the upper world of AN is not an abstract paradise. It is a physical place to which one can measure a distance. Sumerian scribes used the term Beru to denote a 2-hour journey or distance. One earthly Beru is approximately 6.5 miles, but when it comes to AN, The values change by orders of magnitude. The starting point is marked on the map of Nippur from the Temple of Iker. Cuneiform lists state that the distance from Duranki to An is a specific number of biru. Why did the cartographer decide to mark a vector to this object on the city map? Imagine a modern map of New York City where a vector from Central Park points to the moon. This makes no sense for an official collecting taxes from merchants. The Akur ziggurat was a massive structure with deep foundations. Temperatures in this region reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. Building such a structure required moving millions of pounds of fired brick. It was an engineering project of colossal proportions. To call its center merely a symbolic axis is to underestimate the practicality of the Sumerians. The line extending from Duranki on the map is accompanied by the cuneiform sign, KS. This sign translates as path or route. It is used in business documents to denote caravan routes. In other words, we are looking at a route that begins in the city center and extends beyond the limits of the earth. And this route is documented on the most ordinary physical map. The British Museum holds texts that confirm the concept of Duranki as a physical anchor. They describe luminous objects that descended to this point. This is not a description of the sun or the moon because the trajectories are indicated differently. The objects moved along a route that coincides with the vector on the Gina tablet. Earthly architecture served as a terminal for something external. We are asked to believe that the builders confused drafting with religion, but the temple's outlines on the map match the excavations down to the foot. The accuracy of the terrestrial measurements on this clay tablet is impeccable. We cannot arbitrarily decide where the Sumerians were engineers and where they were storytellers. Duranki is the physical center of the map, pointing the way beyond our world. Let's look at the outer edges of the Nippur map. Beyond the city walls and the Euphrates River, distinct geometric shapes are visible. In the upper left corner of the artifact, 3 concentric rectangles are drawn. There are no symbols for fields, gardens, or granaries next to them. This element stands out from the general logic of the agricultural landscape. Historians of cartography believe these represent some distant villages. They reasonably argue that cities did not exist in a vacuum, but the dimensions of these rectangles do not correspond to the scale of a typical settlement. If one applies the scale of the city wall to these objects, they would turn out to be the size of a continent. Either the cartographer suddenly lost his mind, or he was drawing something else. Next to these strange figures is the inscription 7ILKU. The word ILKU is usually translated as duty or service, but in Babylonian astronomical texts, this same root means orbit or cycle. The geometry of these figures strikingly resembles a diagram of nested spheres or levels. This echoes the Sumerian idea of the layered structure of the universe. On tablet HS1097, there is another detail hidden in the background. A dotted line leads from these concentric rectangles to the center of Nippur. In the real world, this location was a barren desert with no roads or canals. Expeditions by the University of Pennsylvania found no traces of paving or trenches there. The line exists only on the map, connecting the city to this macrostructure. A document from the Louvre collection, known as Astrolabe B, sheds light on this. It divides the sky into zones using similar rectangular geometry. The Sumerians did not depict the sky as a circle. They projected it as a grid of sectors. The shapes on the outer edge of the Nippur map are structurally identical to these celestial sectors. This is a direct geometric correspondence between 2 different classes of documents. If this is the case, then the Nippur map is not merely a city plan. It is a tool for navigating between 2 incommensurable spaces. At the bottom, to scale, are streets 15 feet wide and city gates. At the top, beyond the edge, are zones millions of miles wide. and a dotted line connects them into a single operational system. Notice the angle of this connecting line. It is exactly 30 degrees relative to the main axis of the Eker temple. In Sumerian mathematics, 30 is the number of the moon, god Nana, and a basic astronomical angle. Such mathematical constants do not appear on canal maps by chance. They fit the map into a global system of celestial mechanics. Official commentaries sidestep this geometric paradox. It is easier to call the strange rectangles unidentified plots of land. But no plot in Mesopotamia had the shape of an ideal concentric frame. Land there was measured using irregular polygons, as recorded on thousands of clay tablets. Strict geometry has always been the prerogative of describing the divine higher world. The artifact from Gina demonstrates the technology of two-level drafting. On a single piece of clay, the microcosm of the city and the macrocosm of the cosmos are combined. The lines crossing the walls of Nippur are not the scribe's mistakes. They are vectors showing how earthly architecture is synchronized with external objects. Geometry here acts as a universal language of translation. You can see these concentric figures in high-resolution photographs of the tablet. They are carved with the same confidence as the city walls themselves. The ancient master had no doubt about their existence. For him, these orbits or zones were as real as the Euphrates, and they were part of the topography of his world. To understand the scale of this cartographic anomaly, we need other texts. During the excavations at Nippur, archaeologists discovered a vast library. About 30,000 clay tablets were extracted from under tons of sand. Among business contracts and lists of kings, strange mathematical tables were discovered. They are now housed in museums around the world, from Chicago to Berlin. Traditional science classifies these texts as astronomical exercises. It is believed that the priests were simply entertaining themselves with complex calculations. This view makes sense, as the Sumerians did indeed love mathematics. But these tablets contain precise distances between celestial objects, and these distances are measured in the same Biru units as on the Nippur map. For example, the text housed in the British Museum under number K.8538. This tablet is known as the planisphere, and it describes sectors of the sky. It lists the paths along which certain objects moved among the stars. The distances are specified with frightening precision, down to fractions of a biru. These figures could not have been obtained without optical instruments or telemetry. Even more intriguing is the text VAT 8917 from the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin. It provides a list of distances from the Earth's surface to various levels of the sky. To the first level of the sky, AN, a specific number of thousands of Baru. To the second level, another, even greater value. This is not mythology. It is a structured data table with raw numbers. If we return to the Nippur map, HS 1097, we will see a direct correlation. The vector extending from the central temple has a textual annotation. Part of this annotation is damaged, but the surviving fragment contains the multiplication sign ADU. This sign is used in texts such as VAT 8917 to calculate cosmic distances. The city plan refers to the mathematics of deep space. This raises the question of the nature of the source of this knowledge. How did the city's inhabitants, who traveled on donkeys, know the distances between orbits? Their calculations of speed and flight time amaze modern engineers. Sumerian tables contain parameters describing the deceleration of objects during descent. This data lay buried in the dust of millennia until it was translated in the 20th century. Official commentators say this is simply astrology, but astrology does not use terms of aerodynamic braking. The texts use the word GIR, denoting an object with a pointed nose flying in the sky. The distances indicated in the text are tied to the roots of these specific objects, and these roots end in centers such as Nippur. The Nippur Library preserved evidence of a unified information system. The city map was merely the bottom layer of a vast interface. Mathematical tables provided coordinates for navigation. Distances measured in millions of miles were recorded in ordinary earthly units of length. This means that for the Sumerians, space was an extension of their physical territory. We look at these cuneiform records and see magic, but translations of the terms inexorably point to mechanics and logistics. Beru measures not spiritual enlightenment, but the time taken to cover a distance. When a tablet indicates that the destination is 10,000 Beru away, it is a trajectory calculation. And this calculation is strictly tied to the topography mapped on HS 1097. These buried records were not secret to their creators. They were stored alongside reports on the wheat harvest. For the administrators of Nippur, navigating between worlds was part of their routine. They logged these distances with cold, bureaucratic precision. The facts are documented on clay, and they await honest analysis. If the Nippur map shows routes beyond Earth, who traveled them? Sumerian texts contain a perfectly clear answer to this question. They refer to these entities as the Apkallu, or the Seven Sages. In Akkadian translations, they are described as beings who came from beyond. They were not gods in the classical sense. They were emissaries or instructors. Academic scholarship regards the Apkallu as folkloric figures. They are associated with myths about cultural heroes who brought civilization. This interpretation makes sense, since every people has legends about ancient teachers. But in the texts from Nippur, the Apkallu are not described in abstract terms. Their appearance is strictly tied to specific locations and geometric vectors. Reliefs in the British Museum depict these sages with unusual attributes. They carry objects strikingly similar to modern devices. They hold bags in their hands and objects resembling dials on their wrists. But even more important is how Sumerian texts describe their arrival. They descended at strictly defined points, one of which was Nippur. The Epic of Era explicitly states that the Apkalus returned to Apsu. The word Apsu is traditionally translated as an underground ocean of fresh water, but in an astronomical context, this term meant deep space or the abyss. On map HS 1097, vectors pointing beyond the city lead precisely there. The map shows the terminals these beings used for travel. The Sumerian text, List of Kings, contains another important detail. It divides history into the period before the Great Flood and the period after it. The Apkalus were the ones who provided the link between Earth and the heavenly world of An. They traversed distances of thousands of Beru, recorded in mathematical tables. Their means of transportation required precise navigation and landing coordinates. Look again at the outer geometric shapes on the map of Nippur. The concentric rectangles may be a schematic representation of their stations. The dotted line leading to Duranki is the landing approach corridor. The ancient cartographer simply recorded the infrastructure left behind by these beings. He drew what was a physical reality for his ancestors. Official historians ignore the technical language of these descriptions. When the text speaks of Apkal's sparkling garments, they call it a metaphor for holiness. But the weight of these garments is described in pounds, and they were heavy. They look more like protective suits for working in a hostile environment. The beings from the upper world needed equipment to be on Earth. The map of Nippur was created during the Kassite period, millennia after Apkallu. But the Sumerians obsessively copied the old blueprints of their predecessors. They preserved these lines and vectors even after the infrastructure had ceased to function. Tablet HS1097 is a copy of a much older original plan, a plan for a Bronze Age spaceport or communications hub. The term Duran-Ki, the connection of heaven and earth, now takes on a literal meaning. This is not a philosophical concept, it is a functional description of the facility. The Ekor Ziggurat was a communications hub where the Apkallu instructors were based. The map of Nippur reveals the logistics of this incredible operation. It integrates the earthly city and space routes into a single working blueprint. This data lies on the surface in translations of cuneiform texts. The very same scholars who excavated the city translated these words, but they refused to put the pieces of the puzzle together. The fear of stepping outside the bounds of what is permitted paralyzes academic analysis. As a result, Nippur's greatest mystery remains locked away in museum display cases. Let's piece all the available data together into a clear picture. We have a physical artifact whose authenticity is beyond doubt. We have translations of cuneiform texts done by the world's leading linguists. We have topography that has been excavated and measured down to the last inch. And all these scattered elements stubbornly point in one direction. The presence of lines on the map extending beyond the boundaries of Earth is documented. The use of the mathematical term Biru for cosmic distances is documented. The existence of texts describing the arrival of Apkallu entities from beyond is documented. There is no official explanation for why all three factors coincide. No one can explain this correlation within the framework of simple agriculture. The geometry of the outer rectangles on tablet HS1097 has no earthly analogs. This is a fact that any modern cartography specialist will confirm. The accuracy of the earthly contours of the Temple of Eker has been proven by expeditions from the University of Pennsylvania. This means that the ancient author possessed advanced methods of topographic surveying. He was not a primitive artist drawing imaginary worlds out of boredom. The mathematical tables from the Nippur archives are striking in their complexity. Calculations of trajectories and travel times have been translated and published. Vectors from the city center point precisely to astronomically significant sectors. The 30-degree angle on the map corresponds to the Sumerians' lunar calculations. This intertwining of geometry and astronomy is too complex to be a coincidence. The mass of the Ekor Ziggurat is estimated at tens of millions of pounds of stone and clay. Such a structure was built as an ultra-strong platform, not merely a temple. The term Duran-Ki literally translates as a functional mechanism for communication with the heavens. The texts mention luminous objects that use this point as a reference. The entire architecture of the city was subordinated to serving this central terminal. We are faced with a global system of ignoring inconvenient facts. If a detail doesn't fit into a simplistic worldview, it's called ritualistic. If the numbers are too large for earthly distances, they're declared mystical. If beings descend from the heavens, they automatically become metaphorical gods. This filter blocks any real investigation of ancient technologies. But the physical clay of the tablets resists this convenient censorship. The grooves on the map are carved too confidently and too deeply. The cuneiform signs denoting gigantic distances are imprinted with mathematical precision. The Sumerians left us not a fairy tale, but technical documentation of their era. They depicted a world in which the Earth's borders were merely the starting point of a journey. The topography of the upper world of AN was as real to them as the Euphrates. They exchanged data, shipped cargo, and received envoys. The map of Nippur served as a visual aid for visualizing this massive traffic. It showed the tiny city's place within the vast logistical network of space. It was a blueprint of a hub station, lost in the sands of Iraq. Imagine the scale of knowledge that has been lost over time, we find only pitiful fragments of this ancient operating system. Catalogs, vectors, lists of coordinates, all of it is covered in dust in the archives. And even today, with satellites and computers, we refuse to see them. We prefer to believe that the ancients were stupider than us. A map from Hilprecht's collection shatters this arrogant paradigm. It connects earthly feet and acres with millions of miles of cosmic void. It demands that we view history as an engineering project, and it leaves us face to face with the most uncomfortable question. What exactly lay at the other end of that drawn line? Let's return to the Hilprecht Museum at the University of Jena. Recall that small, palm-sized clay rectangle with which we began. Catalog number HS1097 rests quietly beneath the museum glass. The outlines of Nippur and the strange external lines are still clearly visible on it. This object has survived empires, wars, and thousands of years of oblivion. Official science looks at it and sees an ancient plan of irrigation canals. I look at it and see an interface connecting two different worlds. Maybe that's too far-fetched a conclusion for a piece of fired clay. Maybe that's exactly what it looks like. The two interpretations exist in parallel, separated by a chasm of academic fear. You've seen the documents that accompany this strange map. You've heard the translations of texts that explicitly speak of distances beyond the sky. The term Biru and the mathematical tables aren't going anywhere from the archives. They're recorded in books published by the very same universities that reject their meaning. This paradox is the main driving force behind our investigation. The Akur Ziggurat, the physical center of this drawing, still stands in Iraq. Its foundation reaches deep into the earth, preserving the memory of its original purpose. Duranki, the link between heaven and earth, awaits the day we understand this term once more. We measure its ruins in feet, forgetting the millions of miles above it. But the geometry of the structure itself continues to gaze toward the sky. The Sumerians left us not a riddle for the sake of a riddle, but a straightforward account. They did not hide their knowledge in secret codes or hidden caves. They recorded it on the most durable material of their time, clay. They used standard symbols, understandable to any scribe of that era. The problem lies not in their messages, but in our stubborn refusal to read them straightforwardly. The lines extending beyond the edge of tablet HS 1097 are not a scribe's error. They are a deliberate challenge to our limited perception of ancient history. They pierce through the city walls, showing that Mesopotamia was merely a part of a larger system. The Apakalu, coming from Apsu, used these routes as their regular paths, and the map records this fact with the cold impartiality of an engineer. This small artifact continues to remain silent under the light of the museum lamps. Its lines still vanish into the void beyond the edge of the clay frame. The geometry of the outer spheres awaits new researchers and new interpretations. The data is open to anyone willing to cast aside old prejudices. The clay tablet with the map of Nippur physically exists in Germany right now.